Jason Shiers, welcome to Unbroken.
Hi, thank you. I'm excited to be here. Wonder what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here. And I'm kind of turning the tables on you because you have your own podcast about this understanding called Misunderstandings of the Mind. And I'll link to that in the show notes. So why don't we start? Why don't you just tell us a bit about your background and how you got interested in the three principles?
Yeah. Well, it's a long story, as you know, and I've shared it today in a different way this morning on another thing that I was on, and it's like it gives me a sense of a gratitude, to go back sometimes and look at the chaos and the craziness and the things that I did. My life was very full of chaos, is one of a better word. And chaos to me means everything that was I could do to avoid myself, as in extremities, with drugs and alcohol and bodies and weight loss and extreme diets and seeking, searching for myself, money, sex, relationships, everything, gambling, prostitution, anything I could, at the time, just to escape myself, starting off with a horrific childhood and a tragic loss of my dad when I was young, and then using medicating my experience, finding a way to cope with my internal world using something externally, and I didn't really care too much what it was, over the years. So drugs, alcohol, food, relationships, they were all my coping mechanism. They were what I used to escape myself. And then for many years in the field of psychology, like as a traditional psychotherapist, and seeking, seeking more, seeking in different ways, but still seeking. It's kind of like seeking myself unknowingly in psychological concepts and qualifications and statuses, because it really looked like if this thing here that I call Jason, I'm pointing to myself if anyone's on the audio, like this thing here that I call Jason needs to be someone in the world. He has to get things, like things being anything outside myself: status, money, titles, letters after my name, qualifications, credentials, recognition. Like I thought I needed those things to be okay. That's probably part of the reason why I did so many qualifications in the psychological world, and none of them, they were all in service of finding happiness, but none of them contributed to that. I did all those things. I completed them. At the end, every time I felt deflated and thought, well, maybe it's the wrong one. I need to do another qualification. And that's why I have a few, because it's like every time it never did what I thought it was going to do for me. It didn't give me that endless confidence or real belief in myself or any of those things, that I was lost in, you know. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's so much to that story, like the endless seeking with weight. I know we've talked about this, but like perhaps the audience don't know. It's like that, um, to the point of having 6 or 7 cosmetic surgeries, to change my body on the outside, hoping that somehow it would make me happy on the inside. You know,
Mm-hmm.
Even twice waking up in a third world country, having been put to sleep and had a surgery. It's like I was thinking about that today. How desperate have you, meaning myself?
Mm-hmm.
Did I have to be to go to a third world country and let in a not necessarily a backstreet hospital. I mean, it felt pretty safe, but like it was a cheap hospital, to be put to sleep, to have a cosmetic surgery, hoping to wake up thin and happy. It's kind of like that was the extremities that I'm talking about. The lengths that I went to, and committing crime when I was taking drugs, anything to get more. So it was quite extreme. My discomfort, my dis-ease inside myself, my feelings of not wanting to be me, or feeling like I'd been handed a bad hand. I'd been given a bad hand in life. I had this trauma, and I was certainly a victim of everything. That's how I felt. Um, but that seeking, I like when I talk about that, it's like, you know, inside of us there is a knowing of home, a knowledge of something deeper, something beyond our current level of thinking. It's like it's always there. We just don't know what it is. It's kind of
Mhm.
like, and that's the thing that keeps us seeking. It's our intuition of home. It's our knowing that there's something more than the content of our experience, that we're escaping from. But we just don't know that. It's not, no one educates us. Hey, let's learn about emotions and how the mind works and your spiritual essence, in school. It's like, let's turn everyone into a little societal robot. It's like, give them the school ages, like 5 to 16, and then send them to college, then university, and turn them out to work for one of the big corporations, or like a conveyor belt. It's kind of like, there's no education. If we taught children who they were, and
Mhm.
how their mind worked, and give them a more emotional maturity. It's kind of like understanding of themselves. There'll probably be a lot more peace and love in the world. And a lot more creativity. But I didn't know any of those things.
Mhm.
So it's like, and that's how it's tuned out of us as children. It's just really is tuned out of us, that intuition, that knowing of our heart, of love, of home, of the place of the location, or the source of our well-being. And so I was always having this seeking, which is the longing, the knowing, and the longing for myself. It's kind of like, but I didn't know what that was. It just became apparent to treat that with, medicate it with anything I could, from outside of myself. So like, in my seeking, after all the therapy qualifications, I turned to personal development. I went through all the Tony Robbins, what do you call them? Something university or something like it was, with all his courses involved. And straight away I was like thinking, this is the next, this is the one. It's the same feeling as when I took drugs for the first time. This is it. I found peace in myself. My mind went quiet when I took drugs. My body relaxed. When I found Tony Robbins, I was like, oh yes, this is the thing. It's kind of like, it wasn't quite the same experience, but it was a similar sort of thinking of finding something, that was important. But pretty quickly, I felt deflated with that. I just felt like something's not right about this. It's kind of like, and I started to see this whole hype thing where they got people really hyped up dancing and that, and then told them, just for the next hour, you can buy all my courses, at 40% discount at the back of the room. Take your credit card now. And I'd be looking, and there's all these people lined up, with their card out. Yes, quick, let me in, let me have the deal. It's kind of like, and they were going back year after year after year after year for this, like this uplifting feeling. It's kind of like, to get that. And I kind of stood there one day. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and everyone was writing out all these things about beliefs, and negative beliefs and positive beliefs, and how to have more positive ones and negative. And I just sat there like, it just doesn't work this way. It just doesn't,
Mhm.
and I didn't do it, and I didn't go back. I just thought, there's something, I'm done with this. But I still had the seeking, the longing. I still really wanted and longed for something I didn't
Mhm.
understand. You know, and that's when I found Michael Neal, and I think that I only found him by accident, because he had a video called "The Path of Effortless Change," and my life had been like anything but effortless. It had been like walking in quicksand. It'd been a real struggle, a real um, tragedy, and so much chaos and darkness, and suicide attempts and different things. And when I just, the word effortless was like, please give me something effortless. It's kind of like, that sounds the most amazing word I've ever heard. Because
Mhm.
nothing was effortless.
Mhm.
And I watched the video. I didn't think it certainly didn't have an insight. I kind of thought, well, that was all right. It was good. It was kind of like, there were certain things about it that I got caught up in, and found myself drifting out of my thinking about myself. Just kind of being present with. And it was like, and I'd never had that experience before, but it didn't register too much with me what it was at the time. But a year later, I was going to LA, and I thought, oh, I remember that guy, Michael Neal. I'd forgotten about it. And I said, "Oh, he lives in LA. I'm sure he does." So I'm going to look on his website, and I think I was going to like a Rich Litvin coaching training or something in Santa Monica, and And I looked on, and I was going back home on the 5th. I still remember it was the 15th of April. I was going back home, and I looked on Michael Neal's website, and he said starting on the 17th of April as a 3-day thing. And I was thinking, this is just weird, you know. It's kind of like, how come I'm going to be there? And 2 days after I'm there, he's got this thing going on, and I just had to go. And so I changed my tickets, and I went there, and yeah, it was the first time, you know, that anyone had ever, you know, often when I speak to groups and stuff, I say, you know, about listening and about presence, you know, at the start, because it was really the presence and the ability to just not critically consume information, you know, just kind of absorb and let waft over me words, you know. It's kind of like without trying to work out if this was the next thing, if it was right for me, if it was wrong, if it was valuable, if I agreed with it or not, you know, all the things that the brain wants to do, you know. It's kind of like the onboard computer that we have that wants to lead the way in everything, you know. It's like, you know, he just said to me, why don't you just be here and see what happens? And I
Mm,
thought, do you know, like, I'd done more than 10 years of qualifications and training, and the first thing anyone ever did was become unpresent when they sat in the room and somebody started. They take their notebook out.
mm,
You know, it's going to take the notebook out, and I look around the room, and there's this, everyone's going like this, you know, like taking notes down frantically. You know, I've got to remember this, got to remember that, because if I don't remember it, you know, it won't. It's not valuable to me. And it's like there's no presence in note taking. You know, it's kind of like you're not there. And I didn't used to take notes, but I actually started in my psychotherapy training because I felt uncomfortable being the only one that didn't want to take notes. You know, it's kind of like,
mm,
so, yeah, I better get myself a notebook and start looking like I know what I'm doing. You know, because I just,
mm,
to me, the being with people, the presence and the love of that was the appeal of everything that I did in psychology. You know, it's like it was not about becoming academic. You know, it was nothing to do with that. I hated that part of it. But so anyway, I took my notebook out, and from then I took a lot of notes. And then I got to this training, and you know, he said to me, "You can put your notebook down." You know, I said, "You don't need it. You know, if you remember, and if something strikes you, you know, it's kind of like you'll just go like, whoa, you know, and you'll
mm,
remember that. You know, it kind of it resonates with you. You have a feeling of something about something that's said. You know, it's kind of like, and actually, the more present you are, the more likely you are to actually hear something, you know, and the less you're trying, efforting, you know, using the brain, the mind to critically consume information, you know. And it was like, and I just was like, okay, for some reason, there was a love in the invite, you know, and I guess knowing what I know now, there was a knowing, you know, that of something that I didn't know, you know, looking back at it, you know, there was a knowing that there's something for me to see that he'd seen that I hadn't, you know. And
mhm,
that's often why I um, offer that invitation to people when I talk to groups now. You know, it's really about seeing the perfect mental health that's inside of us. You know, it's like, and I hadn't seen that. I really thought I was broken, damaged, and I also paradoxically thought I knew a lot about change just because I had a lot of letters after my name, but that hadn't really helped me find any joy, you know. But I still had the qualifications and the credentials. And that's how I saw the world. You know, it's like who had the most, the biggest, the longest, the best. Just kind of knew you know, it was the most important or had the most to say. That's just how it looked in the material paradigm of life, you know. And in those couple of days, you know, I had this experience where I just felt a sense of peace, you know, for the first time since I'd taken drugs. I guess, you
mm,
know, it was like really, I just relaxed inside. And I always say to people, you know, the heaviest thing you'll ever carry is the weight of your own thoughts, you know,
mm,
about yourself,
mm,
about where you think you need to be okay. That's the heaviest thing you'll ever carry, you know. And it was like I got to put that down, you know, for the first time. This years and years of abuse to myself, you know, and the guilt and the shame and the grief and everything that I carried, you know, and on top of that being a flawed, broken human that was had been told and given so many diagnoses that, you know, never, like, the list was so long that you couldn't even read to the end of it. You know, it's like that in my own mind, I just thought I would never find peace. I'd never be
mhm,
okay, you know.
mhm,
And I just had that experience of just it just went, just disappeared. You know, it was just kind of like not a thing anymore. You know, like, and I realized that what I'd been suffering from and escaping was the weight of my own thoughts about myself. Not a real, nothing more. You know, not a real thing that was wrong with me. Um, not I wasn't a flawed individual, broken, damaged, you know, or any of those things. It's kind of like they were just thoughts that I'd thought daily for as long as I could remember about myself. Just the fact that I'd thought them every single day didn't make them any more real than whether I'd thought them once or not. You know, it's kind of like that's just what I believed about myself. And so yeah, that was my long-winded answer to how did I find the principles, really. You know, it's kind of like, so that was my introduction by Michael Neal to um, seeing deeper, to being truly willing to look inwardly for the answers versus outwardly, you know, which is all I'd done my whole life before that.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. It is such a great story, and I've heard um you tell it before, in a couple of different places, and I'm always struck by, well, I just feel so much empathy for how much suffering you experienced. That's the first thing that
Yeah.
occurs to me. Yeah. And yeah, so thank you for sharing that with us. And um I'm going to quote you back to you now. I remember once on one of our calls, you said, um, addiction is always the result of a busy mind. And that was huge for me. I remember I wrote it down and I put it on a piece of paper here in my office.
Yeah.
And I'd love if you could talk a little bit about that, because it was just so profound for me.
Yeah, I love talking about this because it just makes so much sense to me. It's like that, like the body mind, you know, as we are as humans, is completely intelligent. It knows it can manage everything. You know, it's kind of like, and if you really, you perhaps have never considered this. You know, it's kind of, but like does everything by itself, heals itself, digest. You put food in your mouth, you don't have to do your digestion. You don't have to work with any of the other systems. They just work by themselves. You break your leg, it heals. You cut your finger, it heals everything. You know, it kind of works that way. So like if you like, well, I was doing a talk this morning and I was saying, you know, it's kind of rather than thinking about like the pathologization, if that's the right word, of normal human response to adversity as something in us that's broken, you know, it's kind of like, 'cause that's just an idea we've been given. um, if you think about it as innate intelligence, addiction is innate intelligence, you know, like, and it makes sense because everything else is intelligent about the body mind system. It works by itself, as I've just explained. It's kind of like, so if we're creating or having an internal dis-ease, it makes complete sense that we find a solution to it. Right now, the body mind, like for example, the body mind doesn't know any difference between prescription drugs and street drugs. You know, it's kind of
Hmm.
like, it just wants drugs. I can take heroin or I can take benzos or opiates that I get from the doctor. My body's still experiencing the same thing. It does not give a shit where it comes from. It's the same way that it doesn't know there's no moral or social or any values in what my body does to escape from itself. You know, so it could be compulsively eating, it could be compulsively having sex, taking drugs, doing anything. You know, it's kind of like smoking crack cocaine, drinking alcohol, whatever it is. It's but the system is still working intelligently. You know, it's kind
Hmm.
of like that. You can almost describe it like a pressure cooker, you know, and addiction is the valve on the pressure cooker, you know, and I say that, you know, if anything keeps building up and building up in the pressure cooker, like thoughts about thoughts about thoughts about thoughts, thoughts about me, thoughts about the world, thoughts about everyone else, what people think of me, what I think of me, what I think of them, the more comes, like, and there's no valve of release, you know, then what, for a human perspective, like what's the next option? You know, it's probably suicide or psychosis, you know, it's like from a mental health perspective. So it's great that the body mind works intelligently and it finds a way to cope with its internal experience, you know, and it's just a different way of seeing the what I call normal human response to adversity. You know, I had a traumatic and tragic experience and I found a way to cope with it. You know, it makes complete sense.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on it earlier, but all that seeking and longing that you experienced, it struck me that that's part of our perfect design, that, and you touched on this, that we know somehow instinctively that there's a way to feel at peace. And and so, yeah, I said earlier, I felt so much empathy for the suffering that caused you to keep looking, but at the same time, and I experienced a lot of that as well. And at the same time, it's it's the thing trying to bring us home,
Mhm.
which I love.
Yeah. I think I sometimes refer to addiction as the lost man's way to enlightenment. It's kind of like, because I have empathy for anyone suffering for sure, and I don't mean to make light of it if anyone
Mhm.
listening is really struggling. But like in hindsight, it always looks different,
Yeah.
and it's like looking back and thinking, not that I'm grateful for my loss or any of those things, but now it has happened. It's kind of, and I can see the gift in it too. It's like I can see the gift um in where it made me look. I can see the gifts in so many areas of my life, in my presence as a parent, in my presence with people, in so many things, in the opening of my heart to life, excuse me. Um, I can see so many gifts in that, but like you said, it's like if those things, if the suffering hadn't have been how it was, I may well have just had uh whatever a mediocre life is. I don't know, something different for sure, but I'm grateful for what I've got.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Um, I was reading an article yesterday. There's a link from your website, and it was an interview, I think, with Dr. Bill Pettit. And I love, one of the things that you mentioned in the article was that, or that he mentioned, was that changing behavior is the last step
Mm,
in addiction recovery. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, because I found that really interesting.
yeah, I think I know. I think there's quite an old interview with a long article that I wrote about it
Yeah.
in the addiction treatment company that I used to work for. um, and yeah, because like I wrote about that, and it's part of in my book as well. There's a chapter in my book about behavioral change. Because a lot of the, especially cognitive focused psychology, and so on, and even in psychodynamic and approaches, there's a focus on like, oh, you have to stop, you have to change your behavior, you have to do more of this, do more of that, just take yourself in a different direction, be kind to yourself physically, don't do certain things, and so on. And it's like, that's impossible for anyone suffering. It's
Hmm.
kind of like, I just used to feel so frustrated when anyone would ever suggest to me, have you tried just not doing it or something, or just doing something different? It's like, if you knew what it was like to be me, like the obsession of the mind and the compulsion of the body, it's kind of like when you're in that kind of cycle, it's just too intense. You can't not do it. It's like you
Hmm.
can't just change. So like, but it's still there. Behavioral change. And the thing is that the way that I wrote about it in my book and in the article is that like behavioral change is the end result. It's not where you start. It's never going to be where you start. Because the behavior is in service of coping with the internal dis-ease. It's kind of like it's your coping mechanism. It's
Hmm.
kind of like someone's like saying, hey, stop coping. It's
Hmm.
kind of like I'm just doing it. It's kind of just all it's all like inbuilt. It's habitual. It's kind of part of my misunderstanding of myself. It's what I need to do to be okay. It's like I can't just stop. It's like and saying that, people can stop for a little minute. It's kind of like you can go on a diet for 2 days or 3 days or something, and if food's your thing, and then 3 days in, you probably like find yourself craving, longing, eating things you don't want to eat. Or you can not take drugs for a couple of days sometimes, depending on what the drugs are, but you'll find yourself going back to it or jumping from one thing to another to another. So the behavior is always the end result. It's nothing to do with the problem. So it's like it's another form of our coping mechanism. So it's always going to be futile to try. And like I said, you might find little moments of freedom, but they're not going to help you look at the core issue, which is your misunderstanding of yourself, misunderstanding of the source of well-being, a misunderstanding of who you are. Like that's where you need to look, not at like what you're doing to cope with your internal disease.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. And so if it's interesting because as a culture, we're we're just we're taught that so prevalently. Start with the behavior, right? All the techniques and strategies and diets and everything else. That's where we think we should begin. So if we don't begin there, if someone's brand new to this understanding, where would they start, do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll get to that, but it's right
Okay.
what you said. It's an important point what you said. It's like just because there's whole billion-dollar industries built around changing your body on the outside, losing weight, going on diets, finding the right supplements to support your diet, and all this stuff, right? Because there's a lot of money and a lot of identity involved. Just in that one, as an example, addiction treatment is another one where there's a lot involved in the pathologizing of normal human response to adversity. So they've taken a problem and provided a solution problem that isn't really a problem. You know, in a way, it's perpetuated the idea of us being broken and flawed individuals. So that's the first thing, important point to know. It's like just because there's a whole industry around something doesn't make it right. You know, it's kind of
Hmm.
like, and some people do need just a little bit of nutritional advice. They're not really escaping their suffering. You know, they just need a bit of direction. But it's just you can't find the line of the what's in between that. Um, and like where you would start, is the first thing is like, I mean, not always, but quite often people have had some life experience that feels sticky, repetitive. It's kind of like I keep getting into the same relationship. I don't know what it is, but I mean it's a different person, but I have the same outcome. Or I keep trying to go on diets to change my body because I'm not happy with myself, and somehow I don't last more than 3 days or something. It's kind of like I keep gambling away my mortgage payment or whatever it is. It's kind of like, so there's some feeling of something not being right. It's kind of like that's it's kind of like, and that's when people start to question. Like, well, do I get external help? Do I it's like, where do I go? And maybe people have been getting external help for a long period of time, and they're having more of that. I've been having that for ages. And it's kind of like I've just been putting up with it. But so we've always been on the focus on the outside. It's kind of like, so the first place to always look where I want to work with people is, let's look inside ourselves. It's
Hmm.
like instead of outside ourselves. Not to what we're doing, not to the way you eat or the way you behave or the drugs you take or any of those things. It's kind of like, but let's kind of look at what's happening inside. What's happening
Hmm.
inside right now. How much do I know myself? How much do I know? Who am I? It's kind of like not my name, my age, my job title, my status, my parental, my relationship status. Let's strip all those things away, and start with that question, like, who am I?
Mm. Oh, that's lovely. I've never heard anybody phrase it that way before. That's great. Um, and I think the other thing I wanted to mention too is that that same article talks about how um, we tend to look in the past for answers, um, but what it said was finding a new way to move forward and experience life allows us to live at a different level of consciousness, which I loved. And I remember you, um, I think it was on a webinar with Christian McNeil and Barbara Sarah Smith, talked about how when you were having your psychotherapy training, um, they would, and that's the paradigm, is to look into the past and dig up all that stuff. And you remember how it was just making you feel worse and worse and worse. So I'd
Yeah,
love if you could talk about that idea of instead just moving forward and experiencing a new level of consciousness.
yeah. I mean, like, I use the word level of consciousness slightly loosely, because I don't actually
Hmm.
see there are any levels of consciousness, but it appears, as what you might call a concession or something. It appears that our level of consciousness can be lower when we're caught up in our mind, in our thinking. So I just want to clear that up. It's
Okay.
like the when we're very busy minded, caught up, triggered or something, it's kind of like we might not see so clearly. You might call that a lower level of consciousness. But what I'm really referring to when I say that is that, like, I'm caught up in my mind, I'm caught up in my thinking, you know? Um, and, you know, the past stuff, I mean, like, we're all a byproduct of our past, you know? It's like, I'm not saying the past is completely irrelevant, you know, but you know, it's really important from my point of view to understand what this conversation is pointing to before I even consider. You know, it's kind of like the past, because from my current perspective of being a suffering, separate, flawed individual, right? If I start looking at my past, the only thing I'm going to do is find more problems to resolve, feel more pain, feel more suffering, feel more darkness, further create and cement this identity that I think I am. You know, it's like, and that's a horrific thing to do for anyone. You know, it's
Mm-hmm.
not a useful thing to do for anyone. You know, you don't get a new relationship with the past. You know, it's kind of like, but still part of you. You know, part of your whole beliefs, even unconscious beliefs and so on, will be byproducts of the past. I'm not saying that they're not, but the most important thing you can know is that you're not that. You're not your past. You know, it's
Mm-hmm.
not. It's not about getting a new relationship with the past. It's about learning to live in the present moment. It's about seeing who you are beyond your thinking about the past, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And when you've seen that, when you've experienced a palpable shift in your reality, when it feels like, I know I'm okay no matter what, you know, I know I get lost in my experience from time to time, but there's a part of me that just knows that, you know, I'm not this flawed, broken individual that needs fixing. In fact, I'm fine exactly as I am. Even when I'm not, I am. You know, it's like
Mm-hmm.
when you really know that, then you might want to look at how some past traumas or adversities show up in your body, in your bodily sensations. You know, it's kind of like you've no longer got the story of being a broken, flawed, damaged individual that needs to fix themselves, but you're just still having an experience of the moment. You know, somebody says something to you in a social situation, your body contracts, you feel this anger raise up inside you. You know, it's kind of like, and you feel all dark, you know, and it triggers you into something. You can look at that. You know, it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like, but like, at that time, I think when I wrote that article, which was perhaps about 4 years ago, I hadn't seen this. You know, I hadn't
Mm-hmm.
seen it. So it's like my own understanding is constantly evolving, and you know, and like, and via myself, via my own realizations about myself, and what always brings me closer to my heart, to being more loving, to being more connected to life and to people. You know, because I'd um, originally taken on this concept of the three principles and not really seen so much what it was pointing to, you know, the beauty
Mm-hmm.
of the human design, but more got lost in another psychological concept. And at that level, it can be used as a, you know, a spiritual bypass. It's like almost like I'm a human without a body. You know, it's kind of like I don't want to feel my feelings because I've misunderstood something that I've misunderstood, something that's been taught into me. You know, I've taken it the wrong way, adapted it to find this spiritual bliss that I think is on the other side of something that I am. You know, it's like, so that puts a little bit of information around kind of how I see it now versus what I saw at the time of writing that, you know, but it still makes complete sense. You know, it's like, I think that um, if we really think the the litmus test is, you know, like, if I really think I'm broken, damaged, and so on, it's kind of like looking in the past, you know, via some sort of therapy or traditional psychological process, it's probably going to bring me more pain. You know, it's
Mm-hmm.
like, but if I'm living a joyful life, you know, and I'm content and I know who I am and I'm pretty much okay most of the time, and these things show up, it's okay, you know, to learn to be with my body, with whatever it's bringing to me in the present moment, you know.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Okay. That's an interesting contrast and comparison. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like hearing that. Um, I was wondering if you could compare y- your 12 step experience to this understanding. And I guess what I'm asking is, what differences do you see? What similarities do you see? And I didn't know until very recently that Bill W., who co founded the 12 step program, and it was actually in this same article that I'm referring to, um, had essentially had an enlightenment experience, or a big insight. And
Mm.
then, from what I understand, he sort of created the 12 steps to kind of reverse engineer to help people to have that same experience. So I just love you, as we're wrapping up, to kind of touch on that. I think it might be interesting for people.
Yeah, he did. You're exactly right. It's kind of, if you read about Bill's experience, he had that kind of similar to Sid Banks type moment. It's
Hmm.
kind of, but he'd been exploring all sorts of stuff, psychedelics, Jungian type shadow work, and different things. It's kind of like so. The thing with the 12 steps is that Bill had his experience. He tried his best to pass it on to people. It's kind of like, so the 12 steps are what I call a recipe, right? If you imagine a cake, recipe and method, list of things you need and how to do it, the other, and the method. Now, the method has gone through a million people. It's kind of like, and what Chinese whispers are like, right? Everyone's played that game. By the time you got to 5 people, the story's completely changed. It's kind of, so you can imagine the method going through a million people across country to country, group to group, year to year. It's kind of like, who knows if what people are teaching today are what Bill really meant. It's kind of like what he wanted for people. But the thing is, you can't argue with the size of the 12-step fellowships, the value, and for me, saved my life and a lot of my friends' lives. So I can't say anything bad about that. In my most gentle way, I'd say the 12 steps is a better lie than the one I was telling myself before I went there. It was a different belief to adopt, and it served a purpose for the time. But I do hear a lot of wisdom in 12-step meetings. I just think people don't know what it is. It's kind of like they really have adopted this belief of this unexplainable phenomena, and that they can't, because that's what I was told, and I was so naive when I went to rehab. You've got a disease, it's unexplainable, you need to do these things to be okay. It's kind of like, and you've got to find a spiritual higher power. It's kind of like, well, I was, my whole 20 odd years in 12 steps, I was asking myself and other people, what is a spiritual awakening? I didn't really know. I had no clue, and no one had ever really pointed me to any of those things. So it served a great purpose. It's like it kept me clean, and I went on some beautiful adventures, had all sorts of experience, met some great friends. I went in prisons, institutions, did all sorts of stuff, with the 12 steps. It was always something I was passionate about. But saying all that, for me, there was always still that longing inside of me for something, to know something more, to know
Hmm.
something deeper about myself. And, you know, if you think, like, one of the things I said and I hear quite often in 12 steps is, oh, all I wanted to do was to belong my whole life, and I found something here that I belong to. So I
Mm.
cling to that belonging, feeling part of it, because it qualifies my identity. It gives me an identity, because I'm identityless. I think that I'm Jason, flawed individual. I don't think that I'm part of the oneness, the wholeness of life, the spiritual energy that we're all part of. I don't think that. I think I'm a flawed, separate individual. So, like, belonging to a club, feels like a great thing. It's
Mhm.
like, but you could flip that on its head and say, well, the fact that I long to belong to a club full of people that consider themselves damaged tells me that there's something with what I know today missing from my understanding of myself.
Mm.
Because when I'm connected to who I am, when I know who I am, when I'm willing to just be with my experience, when I see that I'm part of the spiritual intelligence behind life, I don't need to belong to any club. It's kind
Mhm.
of like I see that I'm part of the human race. I'm part of, connected to everyone.
Mhm.
So yeah, I don't want this to sound bad, but the 12 steps was great. Served a huge purpose. It saves a lot of lives. It's a beautiful experience, and many people feel evangelical and fanatical about it. And it's like, great. If that works for you, do that. I never say to
Mhm.
people, don't. I never advise people not to do it, and also be open to there being something more.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, well said. That was great. Thank you so much. We're almost out of time, so why don't you let us know where we can find out more about you and your work?
The easiest place to find me is my coaching site, wideworldcoaching.com. or like you said, listen to the podcast more. There's many beautiful conversations. You know, even a friend just contacted me yesterday. We've been friends for even before I started the podcast, and he'd never listened to it until the last couple of months. You know,
Mm,
it's kind of like, and he just said to me, "I've listened to all your podcasts." He said, "I really like this three principles thing. It sounds really good." You know, and it's like, and I was like, "Oh wow," you know, that was because it was, some of them have been a few years old now. It's like, but they're
yeah.
still such valuable conversations. You know, where we have open and beautiful looking at kind of what's true about life and what isn't, and what's true about suffering and individuality and who we are and how the mind works and different things like that. And you know, if one person hears something that's valuable, I think that that's always the most important thing. You know.
Yes. Yeah. And they are beautiful conversations. I've enjoyed so many of them. Well, thank you,
Yeah.
Jason. This has been amazing. Thank you for chatting with me today.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye bye.